Okay, as I'm sure you can suspect, the Renaissance and the ideas just don't stay in Italy. Eventually they move north. But something that I think is interesting is that, our earliest Renaissance painters and Petrarch, lived in the 1300s. But our Northern Renaissance artists are it will be, 100 or 200 years later. So it does take a long time. Okay, so there's some facts here. So the Renaissance started later. One idea is because still recovering from the plague, the Black Death. And I think also another difference is in the north, you had more and more kings, right? Where we talked about in Italy, they were independent city-states that kind of ran, and so they could have a merchant class or a middle class kind of be the sponsors, where in the north it was mostly monarchs, right? So other ways ideas moved northward. There's, as I mentioned, Italy was always tumultuous. That was something Machiavelli, in his book The Prince, hoped to finish, that if there was one king, then everyone would settle down. So a lot of artists fled north to escape all the fighting. And some northern artists, came to Italy and studied. I also think the usual ways, through trade and other interactions. So take a look at this map so you can see the birthplace of the Renaissance here. And then when we're talking about the Northern Renaissance, we're really just talking about a little area here. So London, what is today, the Netherlands and Belgium, Northern Germany. So that's what we're talking about. Just a small area here, a little bit of France. Okay, so some of the artists in the north are, as you can see, German or Dutch. This is Albrecht Dürer. His paintings were very realistic, and this is his self-portrait. And like we've been saying, they're not always completely secular, that there were religious themes as well. And this is Jan van Eyck. Relied heavily on oil paints. You can kind of see that here, but we'll look at some paintings in a second. And so you can see the dates, right? We're talking about towards the end of the Renaissance. And then here's Bruegel, a self-portrait. He too was also focused on realistic details in everyday life. And so as we look at some of these Northern Renaissance paintings, see if you can tell the difference between Italian paintings. So this one, speaking of Bruegel, is one of my favorites. So details in everyday life. So just take it in. Look at all these details. But these are proverbs. I guess if we were Dutch, we would know what these proverbs are. Here's one we could all maybe relate to. Putting her head up against a brick wall. This is my personal, favorite. Hidden right here by this guy with his head in this black orb of some kind. Anyway, so all of these tell a different proverb, but you can see that I think one difference is these are not nobles or wealthy patrons or wealthy middle-class merchants, but just average people. Okay, this is Jan van Eyck. Probably one of the more famous paintings here is the Arnolfini wedding portrait. So probably a wealthier couple, and this is famous because if you looked at this in real life or on a bigger screen, in the mirror here you can see the back of the couple and Jan van Eyck painting them. And then of course a religious theme. So you can see some commonalities, the rich dark colors, oil paints, the 3D perspective. And here's Albrecht Dürer, so a young Venetian woman, but then also religious figures here and the four apostles. As you can see, very detailed and very realistic. What do you think? Similar or different from our Italian paintings. And he also drew a lot of nature and animals. And look how detailed that bunny is, huh? Okay, so writers of the North, we talked a little bit about Machiavelli and Castiglione, but the writers of the North were more Christian humanists. So while they're studying the humanities and focusing on human potential achievement, there was more of a religious slant to it. And they thought if we studied the classics, the Greco-Roman classics, plus the Bible, we would want to be better humans and reform society. So our three most famous writers, Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, and you might know the third, Shakespeare, but especially these two were very much idealists and spiritual idealists. So Erasmus, I mentioned, in contrast to Machiavelli, he wrote an educational book for Christian princes, how a prince should use the themes of early Christianity to be a good ruler. In The Praise of Folly, it's a satire, and the point of it is to show that people need to kind of reconnect to the true beliefs of the Catholic Church, read the Bible, and be recommitted to how Christianity was at the beginning, at the time of Jesus. Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia. Obviously, that has now become a meaning for a perfect society, and he imagined this society without greed, corruption, or war. And, Shakespeare just wrote, a few plays? Okay, so here's Erasmus and Sir Thomas More, and this is his front piece to Utopia. So this is it's an imaginary island. That's where he's buried. Spoiler, he'll lose his head in his battle with King Henry VIII over his divorce. And Erasmus was friends with a lot of reformers, most notably, you'll talk about next year, Martin Luther. But they were aware of some of these issues in society and perhaps that the church had become too powerful and lost its way. So they were writing, trying to get people back on track. And then Shakespeare, you may know him from such things like Othello, and I'm sure you're getting ready to tackle Romeo and Juliet, and you'll read Macbeth next year and Hamlet as a senior. I don't know what there's more to say about one of the great writers in Western history, whether you like him or not. And then, of course, probably one of the great inventions of all time is the movable type printing press. And so when we jump over to China, we know the Chinese also have something pretty similar. And Johannes Gutenberg makes his own version. So remember we saw that video a while back about how they made books in the Middle Ages, by writing it on hand and using the skin of an animal, of a calf, and just the process that it took to make a book. So you can imagine how revolutionary this is now you can just switch out the letters and print, pages, and you don't have to make one plate or one wooden block for each page. So what this means is that more people have access to the Bible, and books become cheaper, right? More people can afford them. And so we start to see the growth of literacy. And even though we've been talking about the Renaissance as more of an elite movement, as we come out of the 1500s into the 1600s, we start to see slowly but surely this movement spreading down right through increased literacy and access to books. So there you have it, the Northern Renaissance. Feel free to compare and contrast with the Italian.